Chapter 21. As one of the strongest shapers in the city, Jero was confident in her own strength, confident in her speed and the strength of her swords. Yet anyone who could manhandle Pascal, killing him like a dog, could likely do the same to her. She had experienced the overwhelming sense of pressure the giant had exuded, and felt as if she was starting to get a handle on his style of operation. Truth be told, it was one that suited her, calm and gentle on the surface, ruthless and brutal underneath. The one thing she still hadn't wrapped her mind around, however, was what she would actually be doing as a chosen. The last thing she wanted to do was get dragged into some terrible fight that she couldn't win just to get out of a small power struggle with the other gangs. Heading up to her room, she took out the mask and looked at it for a moment before resolutely putting it on. Almost immediately, she heard the sound of the giant's voice rumble in her mind. Tonight. After that, there was nothing but silence, and with a sigh, Jero took off the mask. In the inn, Garrett had grown momentarily distracted, his gaze blanking for a brief second before he shook his head and returned to the subject at hand, his gaze sweeping across the gathered leaders of the Klein family. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to get distracted. As I said, we will soon see the Ebony Alliance bringing goods through our territory, just as they used to. We won't be charging them a toll, and we should just be able to ignore their carts." Seeing Coleridge lift his hand, Garrett gestured for him to speak. "Meaning no disrespect, Mr. Klein, but doesn't an arrangement like that mean we've lost?" Coleridge and his mercenary group, Cleaver's Edge, had stuck around after the fight against the undead. By this point, they had pretty much integrated into the gang. Judging from the way he asked the question, it was clear that Coleridge had already begun to see himself as a member of the Klein family. This suited Garrett just fine. "It might appear that way on the surface," Garrett said, "but it won't be without its advantages. First, by establishing their route through our territory, the Ebony Association will be forced to defend us if it's ever threatened. Additionally, though we're still in negotiations, we'll likely get a discount on any materials that we buy directly from the Ebony Association. The same will be true for the people, and more importantly, the shops, who fall under the Klein family. Getting preferential access to monster materials will be wonderful for business. Just these 2 points alone are worth more than any fee that the Ebony Association might have paid." Coleridge sat back in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest, nodding happily. "Most important, however," Garrett said, "we'll have an ally on the Council of 10 seats." After he finished explaining how he wanted the leaders of the gang to take the information to their subordinates, Garrett dismissed the group and returned to his room. He still had a few hours before it was time to pull Jero into the dream and hear her answer, but he didn't have time to rest. Instead, he closed his eyes and took control of Isabel, sending her deep into the bowels of the earth to meet with Delrissa. Even though they were on the same side, the vampire had a healthy fear of Isabel. After all, her main abilities revolved around physical attacks, which Isabel was completely immune to. Furthermore, having been chased for almost an entire night by the dire spirit and her strange artifacts, Delrissa couldn't help but shiver whenever she saw Isabel's long flowing hair. "Greetings, Guardian," Delrissa said, putting on her best smile. She bowed to Isabel. "Don't do that," Garrett replied bluntly through Isabel. "It makes you look creepy." Delrissa wanted to retort, but before she could, a strand of Isabel's hair unrolled, revealing a gleaming staff. "This is the Staff of Bones," she said, "though you probably already know that. It's being given to you for a specific purpose." This as well, another strand of hair unrolled, revealing the slightly angry-looking lost library of the Necromancer. The skull on the front of the book glared at Isabel, its jaws opening as if it wanted to bite down on her hair, but a calm look from the dire spirit made it think twice, and with a rattle, it flew up into the air to examine Delrissa. "There's a specific task for you, one that will require time and a lot of experimentation. The staff and the grimoire should help." "Of course," Delrissa said, licking her lips as she stared greedily at the staff and tome. "What is it you would have me do?" "We wish to replicate the flower ghouls, but with other creatures. Our tests with the soul stealers have failed so far, but the master simply doesn't have enough time to devote to it. to figure it out. Additionally, we want an aquatic creature as well, something that can be used in the swamp. It would be best if it was amphibious, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I hear and obey, Delrissa said, reaching out and taking the staff. She brushed her fingers lightly over the skeletal hand that rested on the end, unable to contain the excitement in her eyes. She had once seen this artifact in Agmayoth's hands, though she had never seen him use it, and had always dreamed of the day when she would get to wield artifacts like this as well. When she reached for the grimoire, it floated out of her grasp, and the skull hissed at her. You may bind the staff. The grimoire, however, belongs to the master, Isabel said. It would be better not to try. However, it will assist you, sharing with you what information you need to know. Delrissa bowed again and hurried off to gather her minions and begin hunting for monsters who could be transformed like the flower ghouls. Still controlling Isabel, Garrett headed to the Cauldron of Souls. This was the last of the artifacts left behind, and he had a feeling that it would take a lot longer to refine than any of the others. After examining it for a while, Garrett realized that night had fallen, and with a thought, he summoned Isabel back, before disconnecting and entering the dream world. Jero had already shut herself in her room and was lying down on her bed. With a deep breath, she put the mask on her face, and a moment later, she felt a tug on her consciousness. Instead of fighting it, she went with it, and found herself standing in the stone hall she had dreamed of a few nights earlier. This time, there was nobody in the other seats, at least that Jero could see, but the giant still sat on the throne, exuding a faint pressure that caused Jero's heart to palpitate. Have you made your decision? The giant asked, leaning forward slightly as he stared at Jero. It took all of Jero's fortitude not to quake. Though she couldn't see the giant's face, it was as if two massive eyes were staring down at her, weighing and judging her usefulness, ready to crush her if she said anything but yes. Not even daring to breathe, she nodded. Yes, I would be honored to serve as your chosen. Her words hung in the air as the giant continued to stare at her before slowly straightening up. The pressure shrouding Jero eased, and in a light tone they revealed just how happy the giant was with her answer. The giant spoke, a wise choice. There will be a day when you look back on this decision and understand that it is the best you possibly could have made. Welcome. Stretching out his hand, the giant pointed at the mask Jero held, causing it to glow brightly, flooding the hall with golden light. The flower seemed to come alive as the giant's power flooded through the mask and into Jero. Garrett, who was sitting on the throne, pretending to be the giant, saw a window pop up. Would you like to select Jero Twinblade as your first chosen? Accepting the prompt, Garrett felt a small sliver of power streaming out from him and sinking into Jero, binding into her heart and soul to connect them to Garrett's. It was strange, almost as if he had a second heartbeat that echoed his own. When he didn't concentrate on it, it would fade into the background, but as soon as he wanted to, he could pull it forward, listening to it carefully. It would serve to keep him updated on Jero's condition, as well as the conduit through which he could pass messages to his new chosen. As for Jero, she could feel a mysterious power coursing through her, filling her body with a sense of weight that infused her aura with the same kind of pressure that she had felt from the giant. Now, let us discuss your responsibilities, Garrett said. First, do not interfere in what I am doing with the Klein family or the Gravewalkers. Jero was unsurprised to hear this command. Indeed, she had already understood that by joining this mysterious, powerful figure, she would be giving up her fight against the Klein family. Though it stung a little bit, Garrett's preemptive agreement to allow the Ebony Association's goods through the Klein family territory softened the blow, as that could easily be spun into a clear success. As soon as the thought occurred to her, she paused, her eyes going wide behind the mask, as she realized that this must have been exactly the same thing that had happened to the Gravewalkers. The whole scenario with the Gravewalkers had been mysterious, as they had been intent on crushing the Klein family in its entirety. And yet, after a meeting with Garrett Klein, they returned as allies. Though it appeared on the surface that the Klein family had lost out, becoming a subordinate to the larger Gravewalker gang, Jero couldn't help but see the similarities with her own situation. Even though the Klein family seemed to have come out on the bottom, the reality was that they had just gained a second powerful supporter, one that wasn't public like the Gravewalkers. In the midst of her fear of the giant sitting on the throne observing her, Jero couldn't help but feel a faint hint of admiration. This was playing the game of power on a different level. Quickly, she bowed. "Of course, my lord." If the giant noticed the change in the way she addressed him, he didn't make a point of it, and instead simply waved his hand, causing a large scroll to unroll in the air. It was a map, showing the swamp outside of the city. "There is a significant value in the swamp, and it is here that I wish for you to focus your attention. However, your gang will no longer just be gathering materials. Instead, we need to fully explore this place, understanding each path, what is safe and what is not, understanding where the monsters live, and where large groups of people can move unhindered. If there are supernatural oddities, I need to know about them. And if there are major threats, you will be sent to eliminate them. You'll have complete access to the markets, and the Klein family and Gravewalkers will both guard any materials you send into the city. Additionally, you're to begin recruiting, gathering more adventurers as you push out further into the swamp. My lord, the expense of such an endeavor will be borne in part by you, and supplemented through other channels. It will not be long before some of my other forces begin to move out to support you, but it is imperative that you provide the main thrust of the effort. That way, at least on the surface, our progress will seem reasonable. Our goal is within 2 years, to not only have mapped the entire swamp, but to control it, giving us an open path wherever we desire to go." The giant's words seemed to carry a pointed energy, and Jero found herself staring at the large dot representing Port Reverie on the other side of the swamp, not daring to think about what her mysterious new lord was planning. Jero simply bowed. "Continue to operate as you see fit," the giant said. "I have no desire to control what you do. Just remember that you are not alone. You have allies. The Klein family, the Gravewalkers, and many other hidden forces. Protect them, and they will protect you. If there is a need, I will summon you. Until then, use your best wisdom to carry out the exploration of the swamp. If you have need, or there is something that you don't know how to deal with, see the leader of the Klein family." "My lord, is there a way for me to contact him without going in person?" "There is," the giant replied, lifting his hand. "I will introduce it to you now." As he snapped his fingers, the hall shifted, seeming to break into a million pieces and reform in the same instant, leaving Jero with a chaotic feeling in her heart. The giant was gone, the throne sitting empty. But Garrett and Sinon, as well as a few others, had all appeared in the various chairs scattered around the room. Sinon was the first to stand, and then each of the others, excluding Garrett, stood as well, bowing slightly in Jero's direction. "Welcome," they said, their voices echoing around the hall in unison. As everybody sat back down, Garrett cleared his throat. "This is the Hall of the Dreamer," he said, "a special area connected to Dreamer's Rest. If you ever wish to discuss something in private with another one of the Dreamer on the Throne's supporters, this is where you can do it. You can access it through your mask, simply by sleeping." "I see, thank you. You mentioned something about Dreamer's Rest. What is that?" "It would be easier to just show you. Geller, would you mind?" A figure lounging in one of the chairs across from Garrett stood up and nodded. He wore a simple white mask, and his clothing was strange. Still, Jero didn't dare underestimate him, as he moved with the calm certainty that she had only ever encountered in those absolutely sure of their strength. "If you didn't catch it, my name's Geller," he said. "If you come with me, I'd be happy to show you around." Chapter 22. Shoving his hands into his pockets, he turned and walked away, forcing Jero to hurry to catch up with him. He brought her to the end of the hall, and opened the door, leading her into a room filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the clink of glass against wooden tables. The transition from imperious stone hall filled with mysterious figures, to what appeared to be a run-of-the-mill inn, like those found everywhere in the city, caught Jero off guard, a sight that wasn't lost on Geller. He turned to her, his eyes smiling behind his white mask, as he gestured to the room. "Once you spend enough time in the dream," he said, You'll get used to this sort of thing. But this is Dreamer's Rest, a sort of way station or rest house that exists in the dream. Those who have inadvertently or by design wandered into the dream typically find themselves here. It's either that or find yourself dead, as surviving outside these walls is dangerous beyond comprehension. Come, I'll show you the adventurers section. As they walked through the crowds of people, Jero found that she recognized more than a few of them. Her expression grew more and more surprised, culminating in her stopping and staring when, having gotten to the top of the stairs and entered the VIP section, she saw at least a dozen members of her own gang sitting around a table talking with each other. Over the last few days, Garrett had carefully been pulling members of the Ebony Association into Dreamer's Rest. He introduced them to the concept of hunting nightmares in the dream, helping them grow stronger in their abilities, while at the same time strengthening the hold the dream flowers had over them. This wasn't the first time since beginning to interact with the Klein family that Jero had found herself with a shiver running down her spine. But this time, that shiver embedded itself deeply in her heart. Had she not been pulled into the dream by the mysterious dreamer on the throne, she would have had no idea that members of her gang had already been recruited. She could only imagine what it would have meant if she had persisted in pressing the issue with the Klein family. As if sensing her unease, the white-masked figure beside her patted her on the shoulder. "The dreamer's influence reaches far," he said, "but as one of the family, you have nothing to worry about. Instead, you can use this to your advantage, cementing your position as a leader by revealing yourself to those of your gang who have awakened. Come on, I can do the introductions." Bringing Jero over to the table where Pax and the others sat, Garrett introduced her to everyone. "This is Jero Twinblade," he said, "chosen of the dreamer on the throne. Treat her as you would treat me." Immediately, everyone stood up, bowing as they looked at her with curiosity burning in their eyes. Every single one of them knew that Jero had not long ago been an opponent of the Klein family, and so to see her now here as one of their allies left everyone with more questions than answers. Deciding he would leave it to her to answer them, Garrett patted her on the shoulder again and took his leave. He passed directly from the inn back to the throne, taking a deep breath to calm his jumping nerves. It was a delicate process bringing another shaper who wasn't completely loyal into his mental world, and he could feel the incredible pressure that it put on him. It had also taken him tremendous work to be able to juggle all of the uses of illusory dream that he had activated to keep it looking like he and Geller were different people. With the increase in power he had received from defeating another great ruler, Garrett had been able to expand the amount of space attached to Dreamer's Rest. He had used the majority of it to create the stone hall, where a giant replica of the Dreamer's throne sat. He had been considering doing this for some time, creating a space for those who were directly under him, as he knew that number would continue to grow into the future. In his mind, he was envisioning a three-tiered system. The main great room of Dreamer's Rest was where mortals who had awakened could gather, providing opportunity for them to rest, speak with one another, and coordinate. Additionally, it served as a fantastic place for him to gather information, since all of the conversations were filtered through Somnia, organized and fed to him. When combined with all of the information from the dream flowers scattered throughout the district, Garrett felt as if he could keep a close watch on the pulse of his part of the city. The second area was for those awakened who had become dreamers, creating a positive feedback loop that allowed them to range out into the dream, expanding his territory in exchange for rewards. The system had been good so far, and all of Garrett's tests had turned out positive. Now, he was looking to expand its reach, beginning to pull in awakened who weren't necessarily part of his organization. Though he was taking it slow, Garrett's hope was that eventually, every awakened in the city would be part of Dreamer's Rest, creating an ecosystem that would naturally promote growth, both for himself and for others. The awakened dreamer's missions provided a steady trickle of experience for him, helping him grow and expand as he brought more people into Dreamer's Rest. The third space was for those who had entered the Shaper stage, or who served Garrett directly. That would be the Stone Hall. And once awakened dreamers reached that stage, he would begin the process of inviting them into his service, creating a natural pipeline for grooming powerful supporters. He had already seen the signs of awakening on more than a few of the mortals who spent their time in the Great Room, and once they had successfully broken through to lighting their soul sparks, it was Garrett's intent to invite them up to the VIP section. Pleased with the overall success of his encounter with Jero, Garrett spent the rest of the evening tuning his plans. Early in the morning, before the sun had yet begun to dye the dark night sky with gray, he sensed Somnia reaching out to him. "Yes? My lord, it appears Rin is about to engage in combat." Frowning, Garrett opened his eyes. "Show me." Immediately, his vision began to change, and he saw Rin standing at the edge of a building, which he immediately recognized as Dreamer's Inn. With a start, he realized that she was only a few dozen feet away from him. Her body blended into the shadow as she watched the alley that ran behind the inn. There were 5 figures there, all dressed in black, with masks over their faces and darkened blades in their hands. They didn't speak, and instead communicated through complex hand motions. Though he was tempted to reach out and deal with them, Garrett was interested in observing what Rin would do. Ever since he had commanded her to put a team together, he hadn't paid much attention to what she was up to. But as he expanded his awareness, he caught sight of a few other people in the area, and with a faint smile settled back to watch a good show. With careful, quiet steps, the 5 men dressed in black approached the back door of the inn. This would put them in the hallway right outside Garrett's room, and he could almost guarantee that he was their target, from the way they kept looking towards the corner of the building where his room was located. Even though that meant they were staring directly at Rin, she didn't move, her soul spark empowering the shadows around her to completely hide her from their view. One of them crouched by the back door, carefully testing to see if it was locked, which it was, while the others stood around him. He took out a set of lockpicks and began to work on the door, standing up as it sprang open a few moments later. Still, Rin didn't move, remaining completely motionless as she watched the group of men step into the inn. It was only when the third of the black-clothed figures had slipped in through the open doorway that she suddenly sprang into action. The shadows around her expanded like a pair of powerful wings, and she shot forward, literally flying through the air, her dagger heading towards the rearmost enemy's heart. He had been watching the alley, and now his eyes widened in shock as Rin's figure appeared as if from nowhere, the dagger she carried flashing toward him. He lifted his own blade to block, but one of Rin's wings abruptly extended, wrapping around him and pinning him in place. Her dagger shifted slightly, cutting up through his throat and into his chin. It had happened so fast he hadn't had time to scream, but one of his companions heard the muffled thud as the hilt of Rin's dagger caught on the man's jawbone. Letting out a low whistle to alert the others, he spun around, only to find himself staring at the back of his trembling companion, who Rin had just thrown at him. Inside the inn, the first of the would-be assassins had begun to creep down the hall. His senses screamed a warning at him, and he threw himself backward as fast as he could. It wasn't fast enough to escape the bolt that shot from Abby's crossbow. As he stepped around the corner, the bolt ripped through the assassin's chest, leaving a large, gaping wound where his heart should have been. The bolt carried on, nailing the next assassin in the shoulder, causing his entire body to spin around. The third assassin, who had just entered the inn, tried to scramble out backward, but before he could, a gleaming cleaver spun through the air and chopped into his neck. Striding down the hall, Francis gripped the handle and tore it free, ignoring the splash of blood that covered his apron. He lifted the cleaver into the air and brought it down, ending the man's life. Rin stepped into the doorway, looking over the 3 assassins killed inside. "You didn't leave any of them alive?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Was I supposed to?" Francis replied, punctuating his opinion on the matter by spitting on one of the corpses. "It would have been nice, but it doesn't really matter," Rin said. "I've been tracking these guys for almost a day and a half." "Do you know who hired them?" Abius asked. "Yes, one of Marcus Parrow's business partners. After we get cleaned up here, why don't we go and pay him a little visit?" "I can take care of this," Francis said, gesturing to the bodies with his cleaver. "It'll be as if no one ever showed up. You guys go ahead." "All right, we'll be back soon." Abias trailed Rin as they left the inn through the back door, and a moment later, Francis came out, carrying the 3 dead bodies. Garrett had been aware for a long time that his cook was awakened, but as the man had seemed to value his privacy, he had never dug into his past. Rin, on the other hand, clearly had. There wasn't long until dawn, so Rin and Abias moved quickly. When they arrived outside the mansion home of the man who had hired the assassins, Rin had Abias take position on a nearby roof to provide cover for her, and then slipped inside the estate. Even before she was awakened, she had been an expert thief, and now, with the powers overshadow granted to her by her ever-improving soul spark, she might as well have been invisible. It took her only a few minutes to cross from outside the gate, past the guards, and into the mansion itself. From there, she made her way to the estate's office where she began her search. Though she could have easily slipped into his bedroom and cut his throat, Rin had a better idea. Instead, she found a hidden ledger tucked into the false bottom of a secret drawer in his desk. After perusing it for a few minutes, she grinned and put it back, before heading to the safe and going through its contents. Finding a large number of deeds, she stuffed them into her pocket and closed the safe before quickly making her escape. She took a small detour to drop by Commander Fernick's office, and when she saw that his light was on, she climbed up to the window and slipped inside. He was busy working, checking through the massive pile of records, some seized from Marcus Parrow's estate and some turned in by the overseer, who had revealed all of his corruption. Hearing a sound at the window, Commander Fernick looked up and then froze in shock as he saw Rin standing there, lounging against the windowsill. She was dressed in black, her figure blending in with the darkness of the sky outside. On her face, however, was a black mask that seemed to be made of darkness, causing the rainbow flower splashed across the left eye to appear to be floating. Even as he saw her, Commander Fernick could feel his heart calming down. The symbol of the dream flower told him they were on the same side, and as she spoke, that feeling was only reinforced. Count Arbon has some very interesting documents in his safe that will probably help you in untangling that mess. There's also a ledger that can help corroborate those transactions of Parrow's you're trying to find. It's hidden in the bottom of the desk in Count Arbon's office. There's a hidden drawer in the back that has a false bottom. You'll find the book there. Her words still lingering in the air, Rin vanished, her body bleeding back into the darkness, leaving nothing but an open window and curtains that danced in the soft night breeze. Taking a deep breath, Commander Fernick had never felt so refreshed in his life. He had genuinely wondered if he had made the right decision by committing his lot to Garrett and the Klein family, but he was beginning to discover that the power of the Klein family was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Without them, even the rock-solid evidence that he had against Marcus Parrow would likely have resulted in nothing but a slap on the wrist for the merchant, and the signing of his own death warrant, when those above Parrow came to take revenge. Instead, like dominoes falling one after another, everyone even remotely involved with the corrupt merchant was being delivered into his hands, with ironclad evidence impossible to ignore, marching out to present itself in front of him. Standing up, he walked to the window, gazing out over the dark city for a moment. Then, with a grin, he shut it tight. He walked back over to the desk, picked up the report he had been putting together that listed the names of those with potential involvement, and grinned. It was going to be a good day. Chapter 23 as dawn slowly covered the city, Garrett left the dream, and spent a few moments just lying in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. Things were going well, exceptionally well. But he knew that there was a storm coming, pushing him closer and closer to the centers of power where those who ruled Insomnium plotted and schemed. Rather than be worried, he welcomed the challenge, recognizing that there was no way for him to avoid what was going to come, so he figured he might as well embrace it. As he got up and got dressed, Garrett sensed Rin arriving at his door, and even before she knocked, he called for her to come in. Opening the door a crack, she stuck her head in. "Hey, there's some old guy out front, says he's looking for you." Garrett, who had already been alerted of this by the dream flowers that covered the dreamer's inn, nodded. "Would you mind pushing me out there? Do you mind if I take a bath first?" Rin said, tugging at the dark shirt she wore. "It's been a long night, and I'm a bit grungy." "Sure, Take your time. We're in no rush. I'll be in my office. Alright, I'll be right back. While Ren went to get a bath, Garrett made his way to his office. He wasn't worried about causing the old man out front to wait, and in fact, thought that the longer he made him wait, the better. When Ren and Garrett finally entered the great room, they found the older man waiting for them was still standing by the door, exactly where Ren had left him. He was tall and thin, and his face could have been chiseled from stone. There was absolutely no emotion on it, and as he stood there, he almost seemed to fade into the background, vanishing from sight. He wore the clothes of a high-ranked servant, and as his dull brown eyes alighted on Garrett, he took a step forward and bowed, his every movement crisp. "Good morning, Master Garrett." Having already mentally prepared himself for this encounter, Garrett just nodded. "Hello, Vester." Even as he said the word, he found himself having to fight to keep his body from tensing. Vester was the chief steward of his father's household, and for many reasons, as a young boy, Garrett had developed an intense fear of the stone-faced old man. Now, despite having become an entirely new person, with tremendous power in his own right, Garrett still found that his body's instinctive response was to tremble. This didn't bode well for when Garrett met his father, but he pushed that worry out of his mind, and instead raised his eyebrow at Vester, as if asking why the old man had come. "Your father received your letter," Vester said, straightening up and looking down at Garrett along his long nose, "and is quite gratified to hear you are well." He had feared the worst after the incident, and expressed relief to find his fears unfounded. "He requests your presence at your earliest convenience, and instructed me to escort you." "Well, you see, I'm afraid I have a rather busy day planned," Garrett said, hoping to see at least a twitch on the old servant's face. Instead, he just got a calm, cold stare. "I'm sure your plans can wait, Master Garrett. After all, your father does not appreciate being kept waiting." Ren clearly didn't like the old man's tone, but a mental command from Garrett kept her from jumping across the room and slapping the teeth right out of his face. Closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, Garrett nodded. "Fine. We can go this morning, but only after I've had my breakfast." "Of course, sir." Pushing him to one of the tables, Ren sat down next to him as Francis brought out their breakfast. As if by magic, Vester appeared next to Garrett, taking the food from the startled cook and serving it. For the entirety of the meal, he stood behind Garrett, assisting him with his napkin, his silverware, any additional food Francis brought out, and making sure his cup stayed full. Though she was thrown off at first, Ren was startled at how professional the old man was, never getting in the way and moving in absolute silence. Still, his very presence dampened the atmosphere of the inn, and with a sigh, Garrett finally pushed his plate back. "I find myself without an appetite with you here," he said, glancing up at Vester, who simply inclined his head and apologized in the same calm voice. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. If you're done with your meal, now might be a wonderful time to go and see your father." "Sure. Lead the way." Ren immediately jumped up and took the handles of Garrett's wheelchair, pushing him out into the yard as Vester followed behind. There was a large carriage waiting outside, and as soon as they left the inn, the footman, who had been standing with the horses, hurried over to open the carriage door. For the first time, Vester seemed to freeze, not quite knowing what to do. But Ren came to Garrett's rescue, picking him up and lifting him into the carriage, as if he weighed nothing. That earned her an extra long look from Vester, which she ignored. When she started to get into the carriage, Vester coughed lightly into his fist, as if clearing his throat. "Excuse me, young master, but your father would like to see you alone." "Do you really think?" Ren started to say, and Garrett cut her off with a wave. "It's fine, Ren. Thank you very much for your help. I'll be back later this afternoon." "Are you sure it's safe?" Ren asked, her hard stare never leaving Vester's emotionless face. "It is my home," Garrett said. "Or at least, the home where I grew up. I'm sure I'll be fine." Though she knew that Garrett was even stronger than she was, Ren still was loath to let him out of her sight. She had clearly taken a disliking to Vester, and the thought of sending Garrett with him rubbed her the wrong way. Still, She knew better than to argue with Garrett, and so she stepped back and instructed the footman to put Garrett's wheelchair on the roof, and only let them leave once she was sure that it had been secured. The ride through the city was long, and more than once Garrett saw Vester's eyes drifting to his missing wrist and hand, though it was impossible to tell whether the steward was curious or not. Garrett found himself wondering at the man's thoughts. Before he could ask, however, they pulled up to a modest-looking home on the outskirts of the noble district, and a wave of memories rushed through Garrett's head. This was the Klein family home, passed down for 6 generations by those who served the royal family. Each member of the Klein family who had owned the home had served in different capacities, slowly climbing from servants in the royal palace until they wielded power comparable to even the strongest of nobles. Garrett's grandfather had been the one who convinced the late king to assign Garrett as the study companion for Prince Aviron, and who had groomed Garrett's father, Victor Klein, to be the king's most trusted advisor. Ostensibly, the Klein family was absolutely neutral, not taking part in any of the power plays that gripped the city. And once, Garrett had actually believed it to be true. He knew better now, however, and as the carriage drew up to the front door, he found himself short of breath. If there was one thing that Garrett had been avoiding doing since arriving in this world, it was facing Victor Klein. But now, he couldn't put it off any longer. Hearing the sound of his wheelchair being unhooked and carried down from the roof of the carriage caused his heartbeat to increase. When the door opened and Vester picked him up to carry him out of the carriage, Garrett felt stuffy in his chest. Settling himself in his wheelchair, he took a deep breath as it was lifted up the stairs to the front door, which opened wide, leading into a simple hallway. There was a single maid standing in the hall to welcome them, and in a quiet voice, she alerted Vester that the master of the house was in the library. There was nothing ornate about this house. No fancy decorations. No gilt molding. The wallpaper was simple. The ceilings painted white. The only ornamentation was a single functional mirror that stood over a small table by the door. As he breathed in, Garrett could smell years of history. His own history. "Bring Master Garrett," Vester said to the maid, who hurried behind Garrett's wheelchair, gingerly taking hold of the handles and pushing him down the hall after the steward. Garrett could have found his way to the library himself. After all, every inch of this house was firmly fixed in his mind. But instead, he used the time that it took to get from the front door to the library to calm his racing heart, to steady his breathing, and to remind himself that while he was still Garrett Klein, he was now much more. Still, it was hard to stop the wave of emotions that raced through him when he saw past Vester into the library. Nothing had changed, from the books on the walls to the dozen portraits hung above the fireplace. A simple wooden desk in front of the fire was occupied by a handsome man whose dark hair was just starting to turn gray. His face was wider than Garrett's, with an almost brutish set to his jaw and cheekbones, and his body was thick, not delicate like Garrett's. He didn't look up as the door opened, instead continuing to write with slow, measured movements. It wasn't until he had finished what he was writing that he put his pen down and glanced up, fixing a pair of intensely blue eyes on Garrett as Vester announced Garrett's arrival. "Leave us." With a bow, Vester left the room, the frightened-looking maid hurrying out in front of him. Garrett heard the doors shut behind him as he matched his father's intense stare. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Victor Klein said. "Come over here." Suppressing the urge to sigh, Garrett pushed on the wheels of his wheelchair, rolling himself forward. There was a flash of something in his father's eyes, though Garrett had no idea what sort of emotion it was. He could guess that it wasn't complimentary. For a long while, his father stared at him, taking in every inch of his appearance, before speaking in a heavy voice. "Why didn't you send me a letter sooner?" Suppressing the urge to quickly come up with excuses, Garrett examined what was going on in his mind and body with a sort of detached interest. As the two souls had fused together in this body, he found that he had inherited a stronger personality from Geller, likely because Geller had lived longer and had a much clearer sense of who he was. On the other hand, the young nobleman had brought a significant number of physical memories to him. Even though this was the first time that Garrett had truly encountered the man sitting at the desk in front of him, His body remembered every single terrible moment of growing up under Victor Klein's iron-fisted control. All of this raced through Garrett's head in a fraction of a second, as he tried to decide how he was going to engage with this father of his. He felt no love for Victor, and even if he had, would have likely had a hard time accepting Victor as his father. No father appeared in his memories from Earth, and as those memories merged with the memories of a childhood in this world, Garrett found himself disinclined to give that title to the hard man he now faced. Like each member of the Klein family before him, Victor presented a calm and studious persona to the outside world, while ruling his family as the most brutal of tyrants. He beat his twisted worldview into his children, just as it had been beaten into him. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in Garrett's mind, and he felt his heart turn cold. It had taken him a while to remember just why he was so afraid of the man in front of him, but once the memory came, Garrett found it hard to refrain from reaching across the space between them and snapping the man's neck. The memory was exceptionally clear, of the body of his older sister, once bright and cheerful, lying in a battered heap at the bottom of the stairs. Her broken body was unmoving, as her rage-filled father stood on the landing above, his ice-cold glare daring Garrett, who had witnessed the whole violent affair, to speak. Closing his eyes for a moment, Garrett took control of his surging emotions. When he spoke, his voice was just as calm as his father's. "I thought it better to have something to replace what I lost before I reached out." The answer caught Victor off guard, and his forehead furrowed as he looked at Garrett with a searching gaze, trying to understand if his son was telling the truth. Wordlessly, Garrett just lifted up his right arm, which ended in a stump, as if providing further explanation for his statement. "I see. And what have you brought me?" Victor said, not bothering to suppress the disgust that appeared in his eyes as he looked at Garrett's missing hand. "Though not the largest gang in the city, I took over a group of smugglers and have built it into something rather impressive, considering how short of a time I've been at it." A slow smirk spread across Victor's face, and he shook his head. "A gang? Really, Garrett? Didn't I teach you better than that? You taught me it's better to hold power where you can, father. And that's what I'm doing. I happened to land in the midst of some trouble, but through it, gained access to one of the only smuggling routes leading out of the city. We can move goods in through the swamp, into the city, without the city guard being any the wiser. On top of that, I've risen to one of the 10 seats that control the gangs in the city, and have allies among the other seats. Though our gang doesn't have the strongest fighting force, thanks to our allies, we're able to remain stable. And you think this is enough for you to come crawling back here?" Meeting his father's intense blue eyes with a calm stare, Garrett shook his head. "No, the real thing that gave me confidence to write you that letter was Princess Eloise, who is currently staying with me." Chapter 24. For the first time in the conversation, Victor smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, however, and Garrett had to take a deep breath to keep his hand from beginning to tremble. "Now that is interesting news. Tell me about it." Under Baron Galavin's instruction, the princess arrived a few days ago. "Huh, I knew that crafty old goat was up to something," Victor said, slamming his open palm on his desk. Rising to his feet, he strode to the fireplace and picked up the fire poker to poke at one of the logs. "Tell me," he said, not looking around. "Is he trying to raise support to reinstate the princess? I bet he was the one who even asked you to write that letter. After all, I'm sure you would have continued hiding in the northern district, too afraid to contact me, even as you dragged the honor of our family through the mud by associating our name with common criminals." He punctuated each word in his last sentence by poking the log in the fire fiercely, sending sparks jumping in the fireplace. "You are correct, father. The Baron was the one who asked me to reach out, though I would have done it anyway, even if he had not." "Oh, explain yourself." Garrett turned slightly in his chair to face his father, who had straightened up and was staring at him once more. Garrett smiled slightly. "The princess could be very useful to you, father." The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock and the hiss of the logs as they settled. Then, with a clang, Victor dropped the fire poker onto the stone hearth and walked over to stand in front of Garrett. As he did, Garrett felt a cold, clammy feeling wash over his skin, almost as if he had been surrounded by fog. The feeling was gone a moment later as Victor loomed above him. "What do you know of my business?" he asked, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "That would give you that impression?" Garrett knew just how violent his father could be, but he knew that he would have to risk it if he wanted to achieve his objective. So he lowered his head, gazing down at his clenched fist, as if terrified. "Others may not know, father, but I have watched you ever since I was born. I know that you were made for greater things than simply being an advisor, and the princess could very well help you climb to those heights." Though he wasn't looking up, Garrett was ready in case Victor made a move, but after a long, tense moment, Victor let out a short laugh and walked back over to his desk. He took a seat and crossed his legs. An easy smile stretched across his face. The thunderous clouds that had shrouded him a moment earlier were nowhere to be seen. "My dear Garrett, you've always been an insightful brat, but I have to admit, I'm surprised to hear those words from you." Just then, there was a faint ringing sound, and Victor's smile widened even further. "We'll continue this conversation later. For now, we have a guest. You'll be having lunch with us. I'll have some of the servants help you to your room, where you can freshen up." Just then, the door opened, and Vester entered. Behind him were three of the large gardeners that Victor Klein employed. Without waiting for Garrett to speak, they walked over, picked up his wheelchair, and carried him out of the room, taking him up the stairs and depositing him roughly in front of one of the doorways. "You're to go in, young master," one of them said, the sneer in his voice clear. Not bothering to look at them, Garrett sighed, opened the door, and wheeled himself in. One of the large men stepped in after him, shutting the door and leaning against it. "You're going to have company for lunch, so you can go ahead and get ready," the thug said. Garrett was too busy looking around his room to pay any attention to him. Everything was exactly as he had left it. If there was one positive about growing up in the Klein household, it was that he had never lacked for material possessions. There was an entire closet full of clothing of the first order, and Garrett even saw multiple sets of clothes that he didn't remember. They were all cut in the latest fashions, and a few of them looked as if they had just been purchased. Considering he had only sent the letter a few days ago, he was surprised at just how meticulous his father was. None of his other things had been touched either, and as Garrett's gaze swept across the room, his eyes lingered on a portrait of a beautiful noblewoman with the same thin features that Garrett possessed, her face pale with illness. Garrett's mother had died when he was young, following not long after his sister, her will to live broken. Garrett could feel his heart constricting when he saw the picture, but after a few moments, the feeling began to fade, and he found himself returning to a sense of calm. He began to feel the faint sense of loss that had shrouded him when he had arrived at this world, taking over this body. Many of the attachments young Garrett had were bound to fade, and now returning to his childhood home, Garrett could feel them beginning to evaporate. Part of it was that the memories and feelings associated with this place simply weren't worth holding on to. The few positive memories remaining from Garrett Klein's childhood were kept deep in his heart, but the fear that had been buried in his bones by his father's fierce fists was being burned away by the cold anger that he felt. The truth was that Victor Klein was a monster. He had harmed many people, though none more than his family. But rather than feel frightened, Garrett had to suppress the urge to laugh. If anything, the last 6 months had demonstrated clearly that his father had nothing on him. The Garrett Klein who sat in a wheelchair in the midst of his memories wasn't the same Garrett Klein who had suffered under Victor's brutal rule. That single degree of separation allowed him to see the situation, and more importantly, his father, with stark clarity. Lost in his thoughts, Garrett wasn't aware of the time passing until there was a knock on his door. The bored thug, who had been leaning against the door, watching Garrett all this while, poked his head out. "It's time to go," he said. Since Garrett had entered the room, he had looked around once, and then hadn't moved, his stillness creeping the thug out. The other large men entered the room once more, and carried Garrett down to the dining room. He still hadn't changed, and he caught a disapproving look from his father, one that in the past would have promised fierce retribution later, and caused him to shiver in fear. Instead, he ignored it, as he looked towards the door, where two women entered. The first was a beautiful noblewoman, who bore the ironic name Prudence. Originally his father's mistress, she had become his stepmother, after his mother had passed away. Garrett nodded slightly to her, his eyes drifting to the young woman who had entered behind her. "Ah, Henrietta, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us." Henrietta smiled softly, revealing a dimple on her right cheek. She had soft brown curls, and gray eyes flecked with bits of green, but stared curiously past Victor at Garrett, who calmly returned her stare. His smile the very picture of pleasant. Victor turned and gestured to his son. "This is my son, Garrett." "A pleasure to meet you," Henrietta said softly, sinking into a curtsy. "Likewise," Garrett said. "You'll excuse me for being unable to bow properly." "That's quite all right," Henrietta said. "My brother hasn't been able to use his legs since he was young, so I'm very familiar with your situation, and you need not stand on ceremony with me." Garrett caught a slight twinkle in her eye as she spoke. That added a bit of charm to her calm elegance. But before he could thank her, the meal was called, and everyone sat down. Victor and Prudence sat on one side of the table, and Garrett and Henrietta sat on the other, as Vester directed the servants to put the food on the table. As was custom, there was very little conversation as they ate, with Victor occasionally asking Henrietta about her family. The young woman was sharp-witted and lively. Her answers drew laughs from both Victor and Prudence. When she noticed that Garrett wasn't laughing along, she toned down her humorous anecdotes and answered the questions more seriously. If he noticed this, Victor didn't seem to care. But Henrietta, who wasn't content to let Garrett scrape through the meal without participating, seized an opportunity when the dishes were being cleared and dessert was being brought out to turn to him. "Your father has mentioned that you're a businessman. Is that correct?" If she noticed the faint furrow in his brow, Henrietta didn't react, but it quickly smoothed out as Garrett nodded. "I do have my hand in a few ventures." "What sort of things?" "I'm quite interested in business myself, much to my mother's consternation. But my father has a more liberal view and has encouraged me to study under a money counter." Garrett would have been happy not to answer, but seeing as how his father was staring at him across the table, he knew that wasn't an option. "One of my businesses deals in soap," he said. "Ren's Royal Soap," he added, when he saw the expressions on the faces of those around him. "Oh, good," Henrietta said, pressing a hand against her chest. "I was afraid that you were going to say Perrot's Fine Soap." Noticing that his father's eyes had narrowed slightly when Garrett mentioned the name of their soap brand, Garrett tried not to smile. His father, through one of the noblemen who had backed Perrot, had lost a sizable amount of money, at least if the record books were anything to go by, and had only barely managed to keep from being swept up with the wave of arrests taking place all over the city because Garrett had made a small adjustment. "We also have a transportation business," Garrett continued, pretending he didn't know about the tumultuous thoughts racing through his father's head. "Dealing in specialized goods." "Neither of those are businesses that I've encountered before," Henrietta said, a slight pout to her lips. "What sort of businesses have you been involved in?" Garrett asked, encouraged by his father's glare. As she heard his follow-up question, Henrietta's face brightened. "Housing, mostly. My family owns a significant number of homes in the Northern District, as well as a few in the Southern District. Additionally, a few inns in a few of the neighborhoods in the slums." "A few is quite an understatement," Victor said with a wide grin. "What Henrietta's not telling you, Garrett, is that her father, Earl Boron, owns more than half of the properties in the slums." A slight blush rose to Henrietta's cheeks, and she peeked sideways at Garrett, clearly wanting to see what sort of impact Victor's words had on him. Looking suitably impressed, Garrett turned to Henrietta. "My apologies, I didn't realize that you were Earl Boron's daughter." Gratified by his changed expression, Henrietta smiled softly. "One shouldn't trade on the name of their forebears. At least, that's what my father has always said. Though, you might guess at how much he believes that, if you consider where our property comes from." Seeing that she meant it as a joke, Garrett smiled as Victor and Prudence laughed. A suspicion had begun to bloom in Garrett's mind as soon as he had seen Henrietta, and now, hearing his father's laughter, he was positive that he was right. Just then, Vester came around to offer the lady some of the dessert, and Garrett turned to his father, who was staring across the table at him, a smirk on his face. After dessert had been served, Victor pushed himself back from the table, and selected a cigar from the box that Vester brought over. After lighting it up, he took a few puffs, and then looked between Henrietta and Garrett. "I'm glad the two of you have finally gotten the chance to meet," he said. "I'd intended to arrange this meeting some time ago, but with the unfortunate incident 6 months ago, it became difficult. But now that the opportunity has arisen, I wanted the two of you to get a chance to meet." Once again, the faintest of blushes suffused Henrietta's features. It was clear that she knew exactly what was coming. And though Garrett didn't have advance warning, he could guess based on the expressions on the faces around him. "Garrett," his father said, leaning back in his chair as he held his cigar between 2 fingers. "You're getting older. You're not a kid anymore, or even a young man. And it's clear that everything that has happened in the city over the last 6 months has matured you. As you come into your own, it's only right that you get married. After speaking extensively with Earl Boron, we've together come to the conclusion that you and Henrietta would make a fine pair. Of course, there's no need for us to be in a rush, but it would be nice to be able to announce your engagement at the first season ball. So I'd like the two of you to spend a little bit of time getting to know one another. We'll set your engagement at the first ball of the season, and as long as it's within 6 months, you can pick any date you want. How does that sound?" Though Victor was clearly asking a question, Garrett knew that it wasn't actually a question. He could also see Henrietta looking at him from the corner of her eyes, watching his expression. "I would be delighted to get to know Miss Boron," Garrett said, his face calm. Though that wasn't quite what Victor was looking for, it was passable enough, and with that matter settled, he waved his hand. "Why don't you ladies withdraw, and we'll come and join you in a few minutes. There are a few things I'd like to discuss with my son." Jumping up immediately, Prudence quickly brought Henrietta away, not wanting to incur her husband's temper by dawdling, leaving Garrett and Victor alone in the room. For the briefest of moments, Garrett considered simply killing the man across the table. Hidden in his memories were enough atrocities that he would be well justified in removing Victor Klein from this world. But the thought passed as Garrett remembered his objectives in coming here. "It looks like you've grown up," Victor said, his eyes narrowing dangerously as he stared across the table at Garrett. "I expected you to fall all over her." Chapter 25 Life and death circumstances have a way of bringing clarity to one's mind, Garrett replied calmly. "I believe you had been about to tell me of your true ambitions before dinner." "Oh, I wasn't I?" Pausing, Victor puffed on his cigar for a few minutes, admiring the smoke that curled into the air above his head. Garrett remained quiet, waiting for whatever madness was bouncing around in Victor's mind to settle. "You said that you have a smuggling route that can lead outside the city, is that correct?" "I did." "Then I have something I need you to move, bring in, really. I'll have somebody contact you. They'll be heavy boxes from Port Reverie, and they should arrive at some point in the next few weeks." "What are you moving?" Garrett asked. For a moment, he didn't think that Victor would answer, but then his father seemed to think better of it and grinned. "I don't mind telling you," he said, "because after all, we're in this together as a family. We're bringing in weapons and armor. There's going to be a party at some point in the future, and it's best that we be prepared." Furrowing his brow as if he was trying to figure out why weapons and armor would be needed for a party, Garrett heard Victor laugh. "Oh, come on, kid, you can't be that dumb. You mentioned that you had access to the princess, right? Well, Baron Galavin already reached out, and we have come up with the most delightful plan. There are only 2 remaining members of the royal family. The first, Duke Arkoff. The second, the princess. One of them will be inaugurated as the next ruler. King or queen, we don't care, just that they fight amongst themselves." I can see it now. Standing to his feet in an abrupt surge, Victor began pacing back and forth in the dining room, walking the full length of the table before turning and coming back. As he walked, he waved his cigar in the air, his eyes filled with excitement and a hint of madness. And what a terrible fight it will be. Uncle and niece, both desperate to cling to the throne, both driven to extremes. Nothing will be out of their grasp. Poison. Betrayal. And when the dust settles, the city will wake to find both prospective rulers dead. Not one, but both. And into that void shall step the council, proposed by the princess before her tragic death to her uncle. Stopping, Victor slowly turned to fix Garrett with his mad stare. But at the top, there has only ever been room for one. And that, my son, is why we need a little bit of insurance. You'll dispose of the council, Garrett said, his eyes bright as he returned Victor's stare. Yes, I will. And then it shall not be Advisor Victor Klein, but His Majesty Victor Klein. Your help in this will be instrumental. And when I have succeeded, you shall become prince. Whatever you desire will be at your fingertips. And Henrietta? Garrett asked. Laughing, Victor waved his hand. She's necessary in order to secure Earl Bourne's cooperation. After all, she shall be queen once you ascend the throne. Or at least, so he believes. Now, don't go spilling any of this. The girl knows nothing and should continue to know nothing. There's no need for us to get the women involved. Besides, if you don't like her, that's fine. All you have to do is marry her. Once you're married, you never have to see her again. Silence fell over the room as Victor walked to the window, gazing out into the street as he puffed on his cigar. Garrett remained silent, occupied with his own thoughts, until, with a crafty look on his face, Victor turned around, as if struck by a sudden thought. That princess, you said she's staying with you. That means she trusts you. Good. Continue to build the trust. It will make what is going to come much easier. Without replying, Garrett bowed his head, as if accepting Victor's command. Too occupied with his own thoughts to think anything of it, Victor strolled past Garrett, patting him on the shoulder. Come along. I'm sure Henrietta is eager to get to know you better. With a nasty laugh, as if he had just told a joke, Victor left the dining room, and Garrett followed slowly after him. After a nearly insufferable half an hour with the ladies in the drawing room, Victor made his excuses and left, and Prudence followed almost immediately, only staying long enough to encourage Garrett and Henrietta to spend some time getting to know one another. Garrett was clear that Victor would not have arranged a way back for him, and so when he mentioned needing to get a carriage to return him to the inn, Henrietta offered to give him a ride. Hesitating for a moment, Garrett finally nodded. That would be wonderful. Thank you. From the ease with which Henrietta's footman helped Garrett into the carriage, it was clear that she hadn't been lying about her brother. And as the carriage finally left the Klein family home behind, Garrett felt Henrietta relax. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from her, and with an amused smile, he watched her from across the carriage. It was only after a moment that she realized what she had just done, and with a panicked look sat up, straight. It's okay, Garrett said. I'd much prefer you to be comfortable. That didn't help the panicked look on Henrietta's face at all, but Garrett didn't particularly care, and instead turned his attention to looking out the window. After bumping along in silence for a few minutes, Henrietta finally spoke. If you're not interested in getting married. Here she paused, clearly unable to continue her statement. It's sort of out of our control, isn't it? Garrett said, turning to look at her. Immediately, her face fell. It is, isn't it? She mumbled, dropping her face into her hands. After a moment, she put on a resolute expression and lifted her head. I'm sorry, she said. I never imagined that this would be the way that I got married. We're not married yet, and you never know what might change between now and then. For the time being, if you're going to be sold off, you might as well pretend to be engaged to me. Listening to Garrett's calm voice, Henrietta stared at him, a thread of confusion in her gaze. After all, Garrett continued, the city's going to be changing quite a bit in the next few months, and I imagine that our fathers are going to have very little time to worry about the two of us and our marital bliss. The engagement isn't going to be announced until the first ball of the season, which gives us approximately a month and a half. That's a surprising amount of time, so I think it's best that we let things develop in the direction they are, and we can worry about whether or not we're actually going to get engaged later." Henrietta didn't reply, and instead just stared at Garrett as the carriage continued down the city streets. When they finally arrived at the inn, she peeked out the window with considerable interest. "Is this where you live?" "Yes, this is Dreamer's Inn." "It's a wonderful name." "Thank you. Can I come in?" Garrett hesitated for a moment, unsure how to say no without offending her, but the hesitation proved his undoing as she took it to mean yes, and quickly got out of the carriage. The door opened and Rin strode out, her eyes narrowing as she looked over the pretty noblewoman. Glancing past Henrietta, she saw Garrett sitting in the carriage. "Welcome back, boss. How was your time?" As she spoke, Rin smiled, her eyes shooting slyly to Henrietta. "I see you traded up." Knowing that Rin was talking about Vester, Garrett just ignored her. When he was out of the carriage, Rin grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and wheeled him into the inn, pausing on the doorstep to look back over her shoulder at Henrietta, who was still standing in the middle of the yard. "What are you waiting for, miss? A personal invitation? Come on in." With a start, Henrietta quickly nodded. Unsure quite how to deal with that sort of speech, Henrietta hurried to follow, looking around with considerable interest at everything she saw. It was mid-afternoon and the inn was full of people, many of them grabbing late lunches or meeting others to talk about anything and everything. The bartenders were busy, and Francis even more so, but Henrietta, far from being frightened by the somewhat raucous atmosphere, seemed to think it all great fun, and when they finally made it back to Garrett's office, she looked at him, her eyes shining. "That was exciting," she said. "If you think that is exciting, you should see the underground," Rin said with a grin, perching on the edge of Garrett's desk, one leg on the ground and the other swinging. "The underground? What is that?" Henrietta asked. "Well, if you want to find out, you'll have to follow Garrett here. The boss can get you into all sorts of places." "Rin, that's enough," Garrett said, as he flipped through a few of the reports that had appeared on his desk since he had left that morning. "Oh, come on," Rin said. "You're no fun. Are you finished gathering your team?" Grimacing, Rin shook her head. "No, we simply don't have enough awakened who aren't already deployed," she said. "I've got Abius, and as long as we're hanging out close to the inn, Francis too. But Francis doesn't want to leave his kitchen, which means I can only count on him sometimes." Henrietta had no idea what they were talking about, but she looked back and forth between them as they talked, soaking every word in. "I was afraid you'd have that problem," Garrett said. "If necessary, we can call the Red Masks up." "I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting close," Rin said, shaking her head. Just then, the door to Garrett's office opened, and Princess Louise stormed in. Following behind her was Thomas Galavin, who looked as harassed as the princess looked angry. "Garrett, tell Thomas that if he's not going to be helpful, he should just leave me alone." "Princess, it's not that I don't want to be helpful. I'm just telling you that your best move is to go to the palace." "Princess Eloise," Henrietta said, staring at the princess in complete shock. "Etta," the princess yelled, just as surprised to see Henrietta standing in Garrett's office. No less startled, Thomas stared at Henrietta and then at Garrett, who simply shrugged and said, "I've been to see my father." "And Garrett and I are engaged to be married," Henrietta added, causing Garrett to face up and everyone else to shift their shocked expressions in his direction. "We are not engaged yet," Garrett said, rubbing his forehead. "My father has just spoken of how it's a possibility." "Congratulations on your upcoming marriage," Thomas said, completely ignoring what Garrett had just said. Clapping her hands together, the princess rushed over to Henrietta. "Oh, that's so exciting, Etta. You must be very happy." Taken aback by the obvious exuberance in the princess's expression, Henrietta could only glance at Garrett, but he wasn't looking at her at all and was still rubbing his forehead. "Congrats on your upcoming nuptials, boss." His eyes narrowing, Garrett looked up at Rin, his expression promising swift death if she continued down the path that she had just stepped onto. "If I hear rumors that I'm going to be getting married," he said, his voice cold, "I will know exactly where they came from." Smirking, Rin lifted her hands. "Fine, I get it. But the least I can do is go ask Francis for some wine to toast the happy occasion." Laughing with delight, Rin left the room in a flash, moving so quickly that it almost looked like she just disappeared. This caused Henrietta to gasp, as she hadn't imagined the young woman wasn't awakened. "Instead of talking about our personal issue, I think it would be wiser to discuss what the two of you were fighting about when you came in," Garrett said, taking the opportunity to divert the conversation. "What's this about going to the palace?" Crossing her arms and huffing angrily, the princess glared at Thomas. "My father," Thomas said, shooting a frustrated look at the princess, "thinks that the princess's plan to enter the palace is foolhardy, that there's no need for her to expose herself to danger." "And I'm telling you it's not dangerous," Princess Eloise said. "I do not know why your father is so intent on pitting me against my uncle, but I know that he won't harm me." "Garrett, tell him I'm right." Seeing Thomas look at him silently, entreating him for his help, Garrett thought for a moment and then gestured to the princess. "I'm afraid Princess Eloise is correct. Entering the palace is the right move." Seeing Thomas frown as Eloise grinned in triumph, Garrett held up his hand. "Now, that's only the case because my father has agreed to help. If you had entered the palace previously, you would have been putting yourself into your uncle's hands. I'm not saying that he is the bad guy or that he somehow wants to harm you. I'm just saying that you would have had no support. However, with my father there, you should be perfectly safe. It is my recommendation that you should enter the palace sooner rather than later. Thomas, you should try and persuade your father to be the one to break the news to the Duke. You can also let him know that my father is expecting a visit as soon as is convenient." "Of course," Thomas said, excitement filling his eyes. As he watched Thomas say goodbye to the women and rush out the door, Garrett stared after him. He had no idea whether Thomas was actually in on what was going on or not. If he had to guess, it would be that Baron Galevin had kept his son in the dark, not alerting him to the plot that he and Victor had cooked up. The only reason that Victor had mentioned it to Garrett was that he still believed he had his son firmly under his thumb. Shortly after Thomas left, Princess Eloise dragged Henrietta off to talk about something, leaving Garrett alone in the office for the merciful few moments before Rin came back, holding a bottle of nice wine and a few glasses. "Hey, where did everyone go?" Rin asked, looking around in disappointment. Tobe continued,